Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to the Managrind tournament recap. Talking about the top decks, talking about the top cards, and state of metagame for this week's tournament. For this week's episode, we have some old decks from previous formats coming back strong, and we also have the metagame sort of stabilizing a little bit after all the fluctuations we've been having. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Top 4 from NA, we had first place Devoted, second place Managrind Chaki, the guy I did a weekly on actually, it was the deck that he made that was showcased. And then in third/fourth place we have Disturbed Monk, not to be confused with Monk from Team Liquid, and another Managrind team member in Luigi's. Now, Devoted came in first with a Shaman mid-range OTK deck. Now this is slightly similar to the deck that I showcased on the last weekly, but instead of running the Wind Furies with Leroy Jenkins, this one is running Doom Hammers and Alakirs for the Wind Fury enablers instead of the actual spells or Wind Speakers. Gives it a bit of a slower tempo, but much more consistency in terms of burst damage. But anyway, so let's run through the minions, shall we? First, we've got Alakir, because he combos out well and he sort of functions as a second copy of Leroy Jenkins, so to speak. We have Blood Mage, because he's compulsory. Leroy Jenkins functions as one of the top ways of finishing someone, because a creature fireball is really effective. We've got the standard Nat Pagal Tinkmaster. Big Game Hunter to deal with things like Ragnaros, functions sort of as a third hex, or fourth hex if you include Tinkmaster. We had Azure Drakes to hold down the mid game along with Defender of Argus. We had some Unbound Elementals for the early game because that thing gets really large, and if you don't silence it, it can become a 4/6, even a 5/7 at times. And then we also had the Fire Elementals to hold down the late game with Flame Tongue Totems sort of functioning as Rockbiter weapon copies 3 and 4. Now, for the actual spells, we had Feral Spirits, which synergizes very well with both Unbound Elemental and Flame Tongue Totem and Defender, because it gives you all the things you need to go, although incidentally, you can't go Feral Spirit Defender. You need to wait a turn because of the Overload, although the Overload on it actually benefits the Unbound Elemental. Lightning Storm is obligatory AoE removal. It's very powerful with the spell power you get from Blood Mage, Azure Drake, and also the spell power totems. Earthshock is one of the best silencers in the game because it deals with a lot of major issues like the Twilight Drakes, which have so many there's so many of them around now and they're very, very difficult to deal with. Earthshock is one of the best counters to it. Fork Lightning functions as a little bit of extra removal in the AoE category, along with lightning bolts and hexes for the single targets. Rockbiter weapons, not really removal in this deck because you want to use them for that burst damage with the Alakir and also the Leroy, and the final card in the deck, Doom Hammer, which, if you think about it, it's 8 attacks over 4 turns of 2 damage. If you put a Rockbiter on that, you gain 6+ on 1 turn. A Rockbiter Doom Hammer will deal 10 in 1 turn very easily. The actual card itself will deal 16 damage if it goes straight for the face over and over and over again, but something to note is not to use Doom Hammer too much as minion removal because the Wind Fury will damage you more. So, on to Chaki's Druid Beatdown deck. Now, Chaki actually played 2 different decks. The reason I'm going over the Druid deck as opposed to the Shaman deck is because I already talked about the Shaman deck, and also Shaman came first. But anyway, thought it was worth mentioning. So, Chaki's version of this deck. As usual, I'll talk about the deck once, and then for the rest of them that show up, I'm just going to talk about the various decks that people are playing. But anyway, so the deck revolves around holding down the mid to late game with bigger utility minions, and playing minimalistic removal along with some burst damage from the Force of Nature Savage Roars, and just aiming for consistency over big setups and burst. So, for the minions, we got Cairn, who has to be Tinkmastered, otherwise he just wins the game flat out sometimes. He's very, very difficult to deal with. Nat Pagal is obligatory. Black Knight helps a lot with Defender of Argus, and also things like Ancient of War, Druid of the Claw, Earth Elementals, any big taunts. Tinkmaster functions as sort of the Druid version of Hex. We've got the Ancient of Lores to draw cards for late game or maintain your health total against aggro decks. Big Game Hunter because you need to deal with Ragnaros. Ancient Watcher, Defender of Argus is also in here. This is sort of a bit of a hybrid between Dark's Druid deck and Strife Crow's Druid deck. It's a bit of a weird combination because both of the decks play a lot of these core cards, but then Strife Crow's Druid focuses more on the Force of Nature Savage roll and Chillwind Yetis and things like that, whereas Dark's Druid focuses more on the Spellbreakers and the Keepers, the Ancient Allures. So, he is playing, I mean Ancient Watchers, not Ancient Lords. He is playing the double Ancient Watcher with Defenders and also a Spellbreaker and a Keeper of the Grove, the 2 Keeper of the Groves as sort of ways of enabling that. He's also playing the Sunfury Protector. It's really sort of a mix between Dark's Druid and, as I said, Strifecrow's Druid beatdown deck. So, on top of that, we have the Druid of the Claw to hold down the mid game with Harvest Golem to hold down the early game along with the Chillwind Yetis, because if you innervate out Chillwind Yeti, it's devastating. The actual spells, we have very minimalistic removal, as I said earlier, with the Wraths and Swipes. We also have the Savage Force of Nature to really finish out your opponent. But this is a very interesting hybrid between the 2 different popular types of Druid at the moment, and I do expect to see this kind of version come up more often. Now, speaking of something interesting that I expect to see come up more often, Priest making top 4 for the first time in months. I am very excited to talk about this kind of deck. I have not seen a Priest mid-range deck in months. Congratulations, Disturbed Monk, you have officially broken the metagame. But anyway, I digress. Moving on. So, for the actual minions, we have the Ragnaros for late game. We've got the Sylvanas to help out with some of the other beatdown and mid-range decks. Tinkmaster is obligatory. Faceless, you can faceless your own Ragnaros, or you can faceless, say, their Ragnaros, and then take it out with a Shadow Word Death, for example. We also have the Mountain Giants, because you can get them down really early if you're playing control matchup, and if you're playing against aggro, you can sometimes get them down early if you don't draw your early removal on the Holy Smites. And also the Shadow Madness. Anyway, so we have the One of Azure Drake, because the spell power isn't necessary, but it does help out a bit with the Holy Novas. Especially Holy Novas. Holy Smite benefits a little bit for it, but Holy Nova is the major boost from that Azure Drake. Defender of Argus works really well with things like Lightwell. Sunfury Protector also makes a show up here because we do have the Twilight Drakes as well. This is sort of akin to some of the Giant and Shields Up variants of Warlock, but this is a little bit more mid-rangey than those kinds of archetypes. We also have the one of Loot Hoarder to smooth out your draws earlier, because we do have 2 Northshire Clerics, because Northshire Cleric is amazing, especially if you buff it up with a Defender, for example. Spellbreaker also makes an appearance because you need a Silence. Most decks should be running a Silence. Druid can get away with 2 or 3 because they have the Keepers, but most decks should be running at least 1 Silence. Now for the actual spells, we got Thought Steal to sort of get information on your opponent's deck, and also it's just a draw spell that gets you some useful things sometimes. Holy Nova is the obligatory AoE. We've got Holy Fire to just deal with something like a Fire Elemental is the major target for this, and also some burst damage for late game. Shadow Madness against these early decks, Mind Control against these late decks. Shadow Word Death helps especially with Ragnaros, but it's less situational. Then Big Game Hunter can hit things like Ancient Lore, so it's very powerful. And we do have also the 2 Holy Smites for the early game, and also a little bit of direct damage. Now, moving on to Luigi's deck, we have a Rogue Cantrip, and now this is what you could call, I guess, a Puritan type Rogue Cantrip deck. There isn't that many sort of text in it, but we haven't seen flat out Rogue Cantrip do well for a long time. This isn't running anything special, it's just flat out Rogue Cantrip. We've got the cantrips from the Blood Mages and the Loot Hoarders and Azure Drakes and a Nat Pagel, and then we have some of the value minions in Cairn, Leroy to finish the game out because the deck has some problems with some reach, Sylvanas to deal with some of the late game cards, Black Knight to get over some of the taunts, because with running this little removal you get more consistent minion draws, but you also drop things like Assassinate, so you need the Black Knight. Tinkmaster also functions as a pseudo Assassinate. You have Argent Commanders to give the deck some more reach, Azure Drakes because 2 of your 3 removal spells, Deadly Poison's kind of a removal spell, it's also a bit of direct damage, but 2 of your 3 removal spells benefit massively from spell power. Eviscerate at 5 will kill Fire Elemental, Backstab at 3 will kill pretty much anything 3 mana or less. Not to mention killing a Harvest Golem with spell power and then daggering it is a huge tempo gain for you. SI7s are just the value early game minions along with Defender of Argus and Argent Squires and Dark Irons. These are sort of the early buff minions that we used in the original cantrip deck that a lot of people have been dropping recently. Same with Ringleader and also the Harvest Golems and the Loot Hoarders showing up in the early game. Very interesting to see this kind of deck show up again. Not even like a tech diversion. This is not mid-range in any way, this is just flat rogue cantrip and it still works. Now, onto the top 4 from EU, we have from Reason Gaming, Random. And then in second place we had Crusties. And in third/4th we had General, or General with an L at the end. And I still can't pronounce your name. This Thijsnl. Okay. He keeps showing up, and I can't pronounce his name. Anyway, onto Random's Druid beatdown deck. Now, as I said, I'm just going to go over the different texts as opposed to the actual deck again because I already went over it. So, this particular deck, we're playing the 2 Sunfury Protectors, showing up a lot in these sort of Strife Crow variants. We have the Earthen Ring Farseer for some extra healing because you don't always want to use your Ancient Allures for healing. We also have the Cenarius to dodge things like Big Game Hunter while still giving you boost on the board. And Faceless Tech works really well, especially considering you do have the Tinkmaster. You can Faceless at Ragnaros, for example. Since you're not playing your own, you can Faceless big bombs and then just Tinkmaster, whatever it is. Now for the actual spells, the only difference is that this one is playing the Claw. Now the Claw is a bit of an interesting one. Claw is a 1-for-1, so it's not as good as Wrath because you can't cycle them. However, it gives you health in the armor, and it also doesn't require 2 mana, which is very substantial in some situations. I would never run 2 Claws and 1 Wrath, but I think 2 Wraths and 1 Claw is something you might want to experiment with. Anyway, on to Crusties, playing a healing paladin deck. One we haven't seen in months, again. I know, so many pillars of previous formats coming up. Well, not so much in the Priest. That was sort of a thing we saw every so often. But anyway, so many pillars of previous formats coming back into this one. I'm really excited to talk about this one. I haven't talked about it in months. Now, Healing Paladin is a bit of a mid-range, late-game beatdown deck type of thing, where instead of focusing on bursting your opponent down, you focus on stopping them from ever bursting you down. So anyway, we'll start with the minions. We've got Cairn, Nat Pagal, Ragnaros, Sylvanas, Black Knight, Tinkmaster. You kind of expect this stuff in these kinds of mid to late game decks, so I'm not going to talk about them. Tyrion Fordring is an incredible late game legendary which paladins have access to, especially in these more controlling decks. We've got Ysera because you are maintaining your own life, and you can even Holy Light your own Ysera if you really need to, although most of the time the Holy Light will go straight into healing you as opposed to your minions. Got the Doomsayer because while you do have a lot of minions, some of them are much later in the game or more utility focused, so Doomsayer can sometimes do something. Aldor Peacekeeper helps deal with giants especially, along with the 2 equalities. Get rid of most large things. It means you can deal with things like Cairn without having to really deal with them for the rest of the game. While Pyromancer's function is sort of an extra 2 of consecration for the equalities, we also have the Harvest Golem for early game, Loot Hoarders, and Guardian of Kings, which is a huge tempo gain. You just play it, it doesn't really die to anything, doesn't touch Starfire, Starfall, Lava Burst. It has to be spell power killed. It doesn't die to Holy Light, Holy Fire, it just has to be spell power killed. You can't really deal with this thing without hard removal. It's very, very difficult to deal with, and the battle cry is where most of the value is, so usually it's a 2-for-1. Now, for the actual spells, we have an Avenging Wrath, which is an arguably very underestimated spell because of how much it costs, but the actual spell effect is very, very powerful. You can deal with multiple minions, use it as direct damage, or just after an equality to give you an extra coverage for your equality. Now, along with the Consecrations, which is the obligatory AoE, you have 5 ways of making equality work. That's 5 different, well, I'll call them spells, because while Pyromancer is a creature, but he's often treated as a spell, which allows equality to board wipe. Consecration is one-sided board wipe, Avenging Wrath is one-sided board wipe, but they cost more than the Wild Pyromancer, but the point is you want your equalities to be live. So, we also have the Lay on Hands as draw power, because you really need some sort of draw power, and lets you draw into your threats, and also sort of stall your opponent's turns out. Hammer of Wrath also functions as some easy removal for the early game for some of the earlier stuff, along with the True Silvers, but it also cycles, but True Silver stays around. And lastly, we do have the Holy Light, as I said, to heal up yourself most of the time without counter-target your minions. Before we move on, True Silver is arguably the most powerful weapon in the game. The tempo you gain from killing something and then gaining 2 life back from the attack you would have taken from it if you hadn't killed it is huge. You gain 4 life off this thing. It's very difficult to ooze because even if they ooze it, you already killed something. It's a very, very good weapon. Do not underestimate this thing. I expect oozes might come back if Paladins are getting popular, because even though True Silver already got value, normally it's a 2 or 3-for-1. You just really want to kill it. And the reason I say 3 is because the healing can actually counteract some of the burst damage coming out from things like Leroy. Anyway, moving on, we have General playing a druid beatdown deck. Now, this is one of city, so I have a lot of text to talk about here. So the actual deck itself is structured very similarly. We are playing the Ragnaros in this version, along with the Sylvanas, which is something some of them don't play, and also the Zera, much more focused on the late game with this deck as opposed to some of the earlier games. So the earlier decks saw where we saw a classic Strife Crow Druid, where we have very few things that can really be harmed a lot with Tinkmaster and can't be big game huntered in any way. We also saw a hybrid of Strife Crows and Dark's Druid deck. This one is playing the Zera, which a lot of them don't because it's a bit slow, but when you get it down, if you Zera sticks, it wins. It just does. It's very difficult to remove, Tinkmasterable or Hex, and that's about all that's going to kill it, or inequality technically. Now, the actual rest of the deck is pretty much very similar. We do have the Earthenring Farseer in this one, and the Azure Drake. This is much more of a sort of Strife Crow centric deck, but it's playing a couple of weird techs. Now, something to note is that this one's playing the 2 Claws instead of the Force of Nature Saboteur, which gives it some early removal for those aggro decks, because it's not playing as many early quality minions. It's much more legendary dense, so it needs the extra removal early game. Now, on to a non-rogue cantrip deck. This is interesting. From Mr. THIJ, I'm not going to try. Now, this is a rogue aggro deck. Rogue aggro decks have not been around since rogue got nerfed, realistically. Most of them have just moved on to cantrip because rogue has a tendency of running out of steam quite quickly if you go for this kind of aggro strat, but he managed to get it to work. So, if we actually look at the minions, we do have the Blood Mage for the early game. Leroy Jenkins is a finisher. Really good in rogue aggro because they do have some reach problems, as I said, in the cantrip. Same with Argent Commander. We've got Azure Drakes because this is playing a lot more spells than normal. It is playing the Blade Flurry, which also benefits from the spell damage. We do have the Defender of Argus with SI7s and Argent Squires and Dark Irons to hold down the mid to early game with some just consistent minions. And then for the actual aggro, we do have the Loot Hoarders and the Fairy Dragon. We have Harvest Golem as sort of a counter aggro play, and Spiteful Smith as a way of holding down the mid game, because Spiteful Smith is a very difficult card to deal with. Very few cards can deal with it without enraging it first, which is deadly against rogues, so it realistically will get hexed or Tinkmastered. Probably not Tinkmastered, because if they make it into a 5/5, it's sometimes worse, but it will probably get hexed if they have it. Now, onto the actual spells, we do have the standard Eviscerate, Backstab, Deadly Poison, but we also have Cold Blood as a finisher with Leroy because it essentially gives the rogue Pyroblast. We also have Sap to deal with some big taunts, and also things like Cairn because you don't have any other ways of dealing with it besides Tinkmaster, and also a Blade Flurry. Now, the reason Blade Flurry works in this deck is, one, we have 3 sources of spell damage, and also we have a Perdition's Blade, which sort of functions as a 4th and 5th, because you get a ping, and then you also get 1 extra damage from the actual blade itself. It's very interesting to see this kind of thing, and there's the obligatory typo. I always make one obligatory typo, and in this case the obligatory typo is the fact that I forgot to change the deck name thing on the slide. It says random. This is this guy's deck, not this guy's deck. Whatever. Anyway, so the actual metagame right now is very interesting. Like, we are seeing the standard pillars of the format. We have sort of druid and sometimes warlock and shaman and rogue coming up a lot. Not really much a major hunter or anything, but we are seeing paladin come back sometimes, and some people do agree it's a very strong deck. We have priest show up for the first time in ages, and even a rogue aggro deck, something which we haven't seen in months. This is a really interesting metagame to be part of, I think, and it really does show that while the game has stabilized a lot, there's still some decks that people are trying to figure out, and I think we should give the metagame a month or two before it actually fully stabilizes into what are the best decks. I think the best decks will probably stay the same, but the tier 2 decks is what we're looking at right now, and the difference between the tier 2 and tier 1 decks is, while they don't always do well every single week, the point is they do well every so often, and they are things you need to worry about in the metagame and you need to test your matchups with. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback or want to talk about anything, put it in the comment section below. I'll put the deck list in the description as usual. And if you want to come and chat to me or any of the other guys from Managrind, just come onto the Teamspeak. I'll put the Teamspeak address in the description. So, this has been Jotto, signing off.